My name is Marti Epstein, and I was born in 1959 in Denver, Colorado. My parents are Tuffy and Helen Epstein. Tuffy is a nickname for Arnold. Odd nickname. And he was playing in the Air Force Band of the Rockies. He's a musician, and that's why we were in Denver, although my mother is from Denver. And we moved to Carson, Iowa when I was 2.5, I believe. And my dad got a job being the music teacher in the Carson, Macedonia Consolidated High School. And my father's from Omaha, and we would visit Omaha all the time to visit my grandparents. And when I was 4, my dad got a job teaching junior high band at Nathan Hale Junior High School, and we moved here. So I feel like even though we didn't move to Omaha until I was 4, and I left Omaha when I was 18, I feel like I am absolutely 100% Omahan, Nebraskan, totally. I tell all my friends, I live in Boston now, I tell all my friends, you can take the girl out of Nebraska, but you can't take the Nebraska out of the girl. I went to kindergarten at the Thomas Edison School on it's off of Blondo, 93rd and Blondo, I think. And I was in the very first kindergarten class in that school. So when I was in 6th grade, I was in the very first graduating class of that school. We belonged to Bethel Synagogue, and Bethel was a very important and formative part of my life when I was growing up. From a very early age, I had an interest in music, and I had a talent in music, and that was noticed early by Cantor Edgar, Cantor Nyman, and it was nurtured from a very early age by those two people whom I feel completely indebted to from that point of view. I didn't have a huge amount of Jewish friends in school. One of my best friends was Shelley Frank. Her name is Shelley Frank Johnson now. She lives in Des Moines. And thanks to Facebook, we are still incredibly close friends, even though we don't see each other very often. One of the things I love about Facebook is I'm friends with all of my friends from Omaha. I went to Hebrew school at Bethel. I went to Hebrew school twice a week. I was just telling my son this. We went to Hebrew school at, I believe it was the Church of the Cross on 114th Street, because Bethel decided to make sort of a western annex of the Hebrew school, so we didn't have to always come all the way down to Bethel. And now Bethel has itself moved all the way out to the western part of the city. But on Sundays, all the kids who went to Bethel for Hebrew school and all the kids who went to the Church of the Cross for Hebrew school, we were all together on Sundays. And that involvement in Hebrew school and my involvement with Bethel surrounding my bat mitzvah led me straight into being an active member of USY. But before I talk about that, I should probably talk about my bat mitzvah, because I was the first person, not only the first girl, but the first person to do the whole Friday night service and the whole Saturday morning service for a bat mitzvah, bar or bat mitzvah. And a lot of people just sort of assumed I was this very devout religious person, and in fact it was more having to do with my musicianship and my love of performing. Shortly after that, I was trained. I was also the very last person to be trained by Rabbi Katz, Ozzie Nog's father. I have very, very fond memories of him. And I was the last person to be trained by Cantor Edgar as well. Cantor Edgar, No, actually I was trained by Cantor Nyman. I was trained by both Cantor Edgar and then Cantor Nyman. I am a little fuzzy on exactly what the transition was. And then I became the first girl to read Torah regularly at Bethel, and I did that every week from probably shortly after my bat mitzvah until I graduated from high school. When I went to Morton Junior High, and don't have a lot of fond memories of Morton Junior High, but as a mother of someone who is starting middle school next week, I really don't know if anyone can have fond memories of junior high. I think it's just, it's that age, and just get them through as safely as possible and hope for the best. But then when I was in 9th grade, I joined USY. And USY, together with my musical activities in high school, I went to Burke High, those two things were pretty much the absolute foundation of my social life. USY was fantastic because not only my friends here in Omaha, I was friends with Debbie Deutsch and Debbie Denenberg and Tina Render and Elise Richmond and Jill Lusgarten and Steve Wise and the Denenberg brothers, and all these people. Even though they were older than me, we were all sort of in USY together, and it was such an incredible dynamic group of people. I've actually been told even recently that that was like the golden years of USY, the 8 or so years that that I was in it for 4 of the 8 years, sort of spanning my time in it. The other great thing about USY is being associated with chapters from other cities. And so I have a lot of friends even now that I knew from USY who are from Minneapolis and St. Paul and St. Louis and Kansas City, and so it's this network that is sort of spread out from Omaha, with Omaha sort of being the central location for me. When I was at Burke High, a lot of the kids who came to Burke were from Beveridge, and there were more Jewish kids at Beveridge. So when I went to Burke, I had more Jewish classmates than I had at both elementary school and junior high. So I was a little more integrated with my synagogue activities and my school activities, and then I also had my musical activities in there also. I graduated from high school in 1978. And went to the University of Iowa to be a music composition major and a piano major. When I was in the middle of my junior year, I transferred to the University of Colorado, where I finished my bachelor's degree, and from the University of Colorado in Boulder. And then from Boulder, I went to Boston University for graduate school in composition, and got my master's degree at BU and stayed on at BU for my doctorate, and then got a job right after getting my doctorate at the Berklee College of Music, and this was in 1991, where I have been since then. So I've been at Berklee. I'm starting my 23rd year next week, or the week after, and I also teach in a very adjunct way at Boston Conservatory. I have a few private composition students at Boston Conservatory. So I teach composition, I teach music theory, I teach composition classes, I teach private composition lessons. What I don't really do is teach piano, even though piano is my instrument, and everyone who knows me from the time I was a small child knows me as a pianist. I don't actually perform professionally very much. You sort of can't do everything, and I play every day for my classes, and I do perform a little bit, but I love to play the piano, and performing is not necessarily the thing that I love the most to do as a professional musician. I have had my music performed all over the world. I have had many pieces performed in Germany, interestingly enough, in Munich and in Frankfurt. I had a piece for puppet theater, it was called a puppet opera, but there was no singing, so it's really more like a puppet ballet. And I wrote the music for it. That was done in Germany. I had an orchestra piece performed in Germany, and a few other things. I've had music performed in London. I've had music performed in China. I didn't get to go, but and one of the most exciting things is that a piece of mine was performed by the San Francisco Symphony about 15 years ago. But I've had music performed at Tanglewood. I've had music performed, obviously, in Boston and in Cambridge. I currently live in Cambridge. I live very close to MIT. I live down the street from the Marathon Bombers. If you were watching all that on TV, you saw my neighborhood. Berklee College of Music was within the crime scene perimeter, so we were closed for 2 weeks while they were investigating the Marathon bombings. I mention that because I just came here from Boston on the train, and every person my son and I met asked us about the bombings and if we were, if we were affected by it or not. And obviously we were. It was impossible not to be. One of the things I love most about my profession is teaching, actually. It's nearly impossible to make a living totally as a composer. People do it, but I not only teach because I think of teaching in a way as supporting my composing career, but most importantly, I love it, and I wouldn't do it if I didn't love it. I feel very inspired by my students. They are always discovering new things and are always finding new and creative ways to make music, and I learn so much from them. I would say it's definitely 50-50 in terms of how much they learn from me and how much I learn from them. Berkeley is a very odd place. One interesting thing about Berkeley is that I have had students of my dad's at Berkeley. My dad had a clarinet student who went to Creighton Prep. My dad is a musician here in Omaha, performing, teaching music, saxophone, clarinetist, flutist, and he teaches clarinet. And he had this student named Alex Malini who went to Berkeley, and Alex was a student of mine in 2 classes. And I loved that sort of generational thing. We think of lots of things relating to passing down through the generations, but that was something that was so tangible that my dad's student became my student. The other thing about Berkeley, which is so interesting, besides just the sheer numbers of people from all over the world, including Omaha, who go there, is the incredible breadth of musical styles that we have there. Most people think of Berkeley as being a jazz school, and definitely if you want to study jazz, you should go to Berkeley. But you can study music therapy, you can study music education, you can study classical composition, which is what I do, although I like to qualify that by saying it's classical composition in the 21st century. It's not Mozart classical, it's 21st century classical, what classical music has evolved to and has become. You can study film scoring, you can study Scottish fiddling, you can study hip-hop and rap. So anything you can imagine that relates to music, you can study at Berkeley, which is why I think I'm much happier there than I would be at a straight-ahead conservatory, even though I'm a classical musician and I'm classically trained as a musician. I love all the other influences and all the other things that come into play. My son and I, as I mentioned a little bit ago, came on the train from Boston, and the most almost spiritual thing that happened to us is when we were coming from Chicago here to Omaha, we spent most of the trip in the observation car. So it's a car with the huge glass windows, and just coming through Illinois and coming through Iowa and seeing the vast expanses of green farmland and the rolling terrain. And in some places it's flat, and what I try to explain to people that I know in Boston, the flat is beautiful. The flat is the most spiritual and beautiful terrain I can imagine. And my son and I packed our suitcases. My son's 11. He turned 11 on the train yesterday. I packed our suitcases with tons of stuff for him to do. I was so worried about him getting bored on the train. And he probably spent the better part of 3 hours with me, just sort of looking out the window, and we were talking the whole time also, but just, absorbing and enjoying and slowing down enough to be one with the landscape. I love living in Cambridge, and I love the East Coast, but one thing I miss a lot about the Midwest, or at least the Midwest of my memory, the Omaha of my memory, is the space, the spaciousness, the wide open spaces, the landscape, the green. Omaha now is very different from the way it was when I was growing up. There are many, many more strip malls and many more restaurants and just many more urban things than there were when I was growing up. And it's not really the Omaha I remember until you get out a little bit and get on the train and see all the vast expanse of the rolling scenery. And I really just love getting back to that. And one of the most important aspects of my music, the music that I compose, is that it has a certain very broad sense of spaciousness to it. People always ask me, is your music tonal or atonal? And there's not really a dichotomy or duality between those two things. There are many musical languages. But what I do say is that my music is relatively slow-moving and very spacious, and I am 100% certain that that has to do with the kind of terrain that I grew up around. And also, as I said at the outset, my involvement in music in the synagogue was, happened at a very young age. I sang in junior choir. I sang in the adult choir when I was from the time I was 14 on. I conducted the children's choir. I was the organist at Bethel when I was in junior high and high school. And my involvement in Jewish music, I also think, is very deeply embedded in my musical psyche. And there's a very pronounced melancholy in the music I write that I think is not necessarily an expression of sadness, but I think it's an expression of the kind of music that I grew up listening to and learning about in the synagogue. I still have very, very clear memories of being at Hebrew school, and Cantor Edgar, we had music, and Cantor Edgar would have us all sit in this sort of assembly-like thing, and he'd teach us the songs for whatever holiday was coming up. And everyone else was bored, and I just was so mesmerized by his voice and by the expression that he had in his voice. And then when Cantor Nyman took over for Cantor Edgar, it was just basically the difference was moving it up, because Cantor Nyman was a tenor, Cantor Edgar was a baritone, but they had that same unbelievable pathos in their voices. One other musical connection with Omaha relating to cantors is that Gaston Bogomoni, who was the beloved cantor at Bethel for a long time, is now the cantor at a temple outside of Boston, in Needham. And I don't belong to a temple in Boston, but I go to high holiday services at Gaston's temple because basically I'm looking for a temple that has a cantor of the quality of cantors Nyman and Edgar and Gaston, and there's Gaston. So I go to his services whenever I can, so that I can experience the incredible beauty that is his voice. Gaston and I have also performed together. We've done a program of Sephardic Jewish composers, and we plan on doing it in Boston at some point. My father is a musician, as I said, and he's primarily a jazz musician. My father's musical background is probably very typical of a prodigy-type musician. He started playing music, very, very young, 5, 6. I believe he was playing saxophone first. His older brother, my Uncle Ira, was a brilliant pianist and accordion player. And my grandmother, Jenny Epstein, was a little bit of a stage mother and sort of pushed them to perform. My dad, I think he must have been 14 or 15 when he started playing professionally. He was mentored by the late, great Luigi Waits, a drummer and vibraphone player. And Luigi just sort of took my dad under his wing and just threw him out there and made him play. So the obvious question is, how influenced was I by my dad being a musician? And one of the answers to that is that it wasn't necessarily a direct influence, but more an influence of having music in the house. Even though my dad is a jazz musician, he also has some classical training. He went to the University of Nebraska and was a clarinet major, music ed major, clarinet major. As an aside, when I was at music camp at the University of Nebraska when I was in high school, I studied with the same clarinet teacher that my dad had, Wesley Reist. And that was really fun, speaking of musical generations. But the thing I remember is that there were records in the house. There was Stan Getz. There was the Beethoven 9 symphonies with Toscanini and the NBC Orchestra. There was Rite of Spring. There was, all different. There was Dave Brubeck. All different kinds of jazz and classical records in the house, and I would listen to them. And I naturally, without any discussion with my dad, I naturally gravitated towards the classical records. I thought Beethoven, when I first started listening to the Beethoven symphonies, I just thought, there's no other music that could compare to this music. And I remember having a discussion with my dad in the car. My dad sort of would like to ask me these kind of rhetorical musical questions, I think in retrospect to get me to think, not so much to just to get a right or wrong answer. But he asked me, well, Mozart wrote 40 symphonies, and Beethoven wrote 9 symphonies, so isn't Mozart greater, or 41 symphonies? And of course, it seemed obvious to me that Beethoven was greater because his symphonies are longer and bigger, but it was really, I think, a way for my dad to try to get me to think about music. So I also have, or had, I should say, an attraction to music at a very, very early age, like my dad did. So I don't know if that's an influence or if it's a genetic aspect. I suspect that it's genetic. I suspect that I inherited that from him in a way that my sister, who did play music in high school, she didn't have that predisposition. So I always, whenever there was a piano anywhere, even when I was 2, I have a picture of me at 2 at my grandma's house playing the piano. I don't know what I was playing. I was just sort of fooling around, but I've always been attracted to the piano. So when it came time to take lessons, I know that, I didn't know this at the time, but I know that my parents were a little bit conflicted about whether they should push me or not. My dad didn't want to push me into something that I didn't want to do, and now that I'm a parent, I absolutely understand that. My son does play music, and he's talented. He's not outstandingly talented, but he's pretty talented. But I don't want to push him to do it unless he wants to do it. I don't want to push him because it is what I do, and I don't want it to be for the wrong reasons. And I think my parents were that way too. And I started taking piano. I started playing by ear when I was 4, and it became clear that I needed to have lessons. I needed to learn the right way to play. I needed to learn how to read music, and I started taking piano when I was 7 from, I believe her name was Shirley Harrison, friend of my parents. And I remember her showing me how to read music and then read music. So I clearly have some sort of innate ability at that. And as a matter of fact, things like music theory, the building blocks of music, reading music, things like that are what I'm most talented at. That's where my, if I was any kind of prodigy, that's where my talent is. Not so much the dexterity of playing the piano, although certainly I'm talented at that too, but it was the theory, the building blocks of music that really captured me so much. Like all children, I hated to practice. I love to practice. Let me rephrase that. I love to play the piano all the time. I hated to practice what my teacher wanted me to practice. And my dad didn't, he was really reluctant to push me, and I totally understand that now that I'm a parent. I completely understand that. You don't want to live out your musical dreams through your child. You want your children's musical experiences to be separate from yours. So if I said I want to quit piano, they didn't push me. My parents didn't push me to keep going, so I quit. I have to say, if there's anyone watching this video who's between the ages of 8 and 14 and wants to quit their instrument, I would say don't do it. Don't quit just yet. Just give it a little more time, because I really regret quitting now. I feel like I quit at an age where I was developing technique, and my technique could be so much better if I had stayed taking lessons the 3 years that I had stopped. But on the other hand, who knows? If my parents had pushed me to keep playing, who knows? If I would have wanted to be a musician, it might have stamped the love of music out of me. I don't know. Maybe everything just works out for a reason. So I quit the piano. But in the interim, I started playing the clarinet, and my dad was my clarinet teacher, which meant that sometimes I didn't really have regular weekly lessons. I'm practicing upstairs, and my dad's downstairs, and here's me doing something, and he runs upstairs to show me a different way to do it, or to remind me that I need a different reed, or something like that. I just recently, after a 30-year hiatus, started playing the clarinet again, so that's fun. One of the reasons why I do it is because my son plays the trumpet, and so we can play all of the trumpet duets in his book, which is really fun. It's really one of the most fun things. Then I started taking piano lessons again from Marian Wegge, who lived down the street from us. And she was a fantastic teacher for me. And at some point she said, you need to study with someone a little bit more serious or someone a little more advanced. So I started taking lessons from Patricia Will, and she was sort of the piano teacher in Omaha at the time. And it became very clear to me that I wanted to, not only that I wanted to be a musician, but just that I was a musician. I needed to do it, I had to do it, I must do it. And at some point in my high school career, Steve Lawrence, who was my high school music teacher, band director, orchestra teacher, he said to me, you know, there are many, many, many talented pianists out there. There are many talented clarinetists out there. If you want to be a music major and you want to work hard, you can compete with them. But you, meaning me, have a talent that a lot of people don't have, and that is in the music theory realm. And also, he recognized that I was a very creative person. And so it was Dr. Lawrence who suggested that I try to compose, and I don't know why it had never occurred to me before. It's a mystery to me, because as soon as I started taking lessons from Robert Bedell at the University of Nebraska, I would go down once a month I was still a senior in high school. It became obvious to me immediately that this is me, this is who I am, this is what I had to do. And so the sort of slightly uncomfortable thing to talk about is that my parents didn't necessarily support me in that at first. And I want to qualify that by saying I think that my parents are incredibly proud of me now and recognize all of my accomplishments and maybe even like some of my music. But at the time, I think they were really, again, as a parent, I can understand that. You want to make sure your child is going to study the thing that is best suited to their talents, their interests, but also something that will help them to be successful in life. And I think it wasn't clear to my parents that was true for me. It was clear to me, though, and I persevered and I convinced them, and I went to the University of Iowa to be a music major, double major piano and composition. And then I had to go to grad school, because you can't, part of it is that you can't just get a job as a composer right out of undergrad, but the other part of it is that I don't believe that anyone is finished learning after their undergrad in music. It's true in other fields, but not in music. You have to at least go on for more study, so I went on to get a master's degree, and then at that point I decided that I wanted to teach. And you really can't be qualified to teach until you've gotten a doctorate and you've learned all the things. I had a minor in music history when I was getting my doctorate, and the amount of music history I learned just in the 5 years of my doctorate alone has been so important for me as a teacher. I use it in my music theory classes. I use all the historical information I have to inform my composition, actually, even though I'm a very modern composer. I don't believe that modern composers start here. We're part of an evolution, part of a very long evolution. I can trace my evolutionary lineage all the way back to Bach, because the composer John Cage is a big influence of mine, and he studied with Arnold Schoenberg, whose biggest influence was Brahms, whose biggest influence was Beethoven, who owes everything to Haydn and Mozart, who owed everything to Bach. So that's that's how it works, and it's important for me to show that to my students and to explain that to my students. So that's a very long story why I started my doctorate, and then I finished it because I love learning. Sometimes I think I'm teaching college because I'm sad that I'm not still a college student. I sit on my colleagues' classes sometimes, and I think my parents, my dad especially, I think is very understanding of what I'm doing now and very proud and really enjoys what I'm doing. So that's a very long answer to the question I get asked, how did he influence me? The influence was that music was always there. The influence was that he taught me clarinet. The influence was, honestly, that he tried to discourage me. And when someone tries to discourage you from doing something, you really have to think, do I really want to do this? And you end up becoming more convicted, I think, than you would if you weren't challenged. And then just by example. My parents both lead me by example. They're both very friendly, wonderful people, and whenever I'm here in Omaha and I go out with them, we cannot go anywhere without seeing someone, usually multiple people they know. They're such an integrated, and that's a mild word for what they are, but they're such an integrated part of the not only Jewish community, but just, my mom teaches, and so she knows every teacher in the city, and my dad knows every musician in the city, and they're just such a cohesive element in the community in Omaha. And I think that's a fantastic example for my son to see when we're here, and for me to see. And I think that that's something that I've also inherited from them, because I am part of lots of different communities in Cambridge, and hope that I have the same sort of friendly impact on the people in my community that my parents have on their communities, I should say. In 10 years, my son will be 21 years old, and hard to imagine. But I would not have been able to imagine 10 years ago that he would be this giant 11-year-old running around, and by giant, he's almost as tall as me. He will be starting, when he's 21, he'll be starting his senior year in college. And where I will be, well, I am almost 100% certain that I will still be at Berkeley. I don't want to leave Berkeley until they drag me out. The concept of retiring from teaching is one that I am not interested in until I can't teach anymore. In 10 years I'll be 63, which when I was young, my age, which is 53, I would look at 53-year-olds and I would think, as a matter of fact, I think my grandmother was 53 when I was little. It seems so old to me. And now 50s seems so young. 60s seems young. I have a lot of friends who are in their mid to late 60s. I have friends in their 70s. My parents are in their 70s, and they seem young to me. So I don't think I will be retired in 10 years. Unless some calamity happens, God forbid, I will still be teaching at the Berklee College of Music, and hopefully still also at Boston Conservatory. But I don't teach in the summers. I don't teach in the summers by design. I could if I wanted to. But summers are when I do a lot of my composing, a lot of my own personal work. And depending on what my son is doing in his life in the summers, I have this fantasy, actually, of getting a small little house somewhere in the middle of a small town in Nebraska, and going and living in that house for the summer and composing, being, where it's very quiet, where it's very isolated. I actually need to be somewhat isolated to get my best composing done, and I artificially engineer that isolation in my own life. I know other composers who do similar things. There's a famous composer in Boston named John Harbison who has a little tiny house somewhere in Wisconsin where he goes in the summers to compose. I love western Nebraska. I love the terrain. I can easily imagine me just sort of 3 to 4 months out of the year just going and having my little composing retreat. I don't know if I would feel prohibitively isolated doing that, but I also can imagine, becoming part of that community as well. And I don't know. It's a fantasy. I don't know if I would do it, but I would seriously entertain doing something like that. 20 years, I imagine I will still be doing the same thing. Now, 30 years, I have several colleagues at Berklee in their 80s who are starting to retire and starting to step down. I have a colleague who passed away last year at 91, and he was still teaching until the semester he died. So clearly this is an environment at the Berklee College of Music where we have lots of young faculty, but if you can still teach, still can impart the wisdom that you have, it's encouraged. And so, I try to keep my health as good as possible, and if I'm healthy, I would like to stay in my current profession as long as I can. So my son Gideon, who just turned 11 yesterday, has some very, I don't know if I call them unique talents, but they're sort of unusual for most kids his age. One is that he from a very, very early age has loved trains, has loved engineering, has loved any sort of mass transit system. So he fantasizes about different kinds of bus routes that he could design and different kinds of subway routes that he could design. And one thing that I would like to say to Gideon as he is starting middle school, if other kids tease him about, or if I'm going to speak to Gideon directly, if other kids are going to tease you about things that you love like that, try to ignore that. Just because they're teasing you doesn't mean it's wrong or bad. That's a very unique love that he has. And I believe that the mass transit system in Boston has very excellent things about it, and it has very terrible things about it. And my fantasy for Gideon is that he will grow up and go to MIT and major in civil engineering of some type, and he will save the MBTA. He will be the savior of the Boston mass transit system. So I don't know if that will actually happen, and if he doesn't want it to happen, that's fine. But what I would like to say to him is, don't lose that love, even if people make fun of you for it. The other thing is, Gideon is a hockey player, and he is a very tenacious and persevering hockey player. He's not the most talented hockey player. So what I would say is keep persevering and keep working hard, because the kids who work really hard actually end up excelling even more than the kids who just have raw talent. And he is very fast, and he has really excellent eyesight, and so I would say keep playing hockey, even if you end up being one of the smaller kids. Keep playing, keep trying, keep working on your skating skills, keep persevering. Just recently, Gideon participated in a triathlon, kids triathlon. We have a New England kids triathlon, and it's 200 meters of swimming, 6 miles of biking, and 1 mile of running. It was last year when he did it, he was in the junior division, and the distances were all half as long as they were this year. And so he jumped up to distances that were twice the length of what he did last year. He had to compete with the 11-year-old boys, but he wasn't 11 yet. He was still 10, and he had to train in what was one of the worst heat waves ever in Massachusetts. And his dad and I weren't 100% sure he would be able to finish, and he finished. He finished 33rd out of 38 11-year-old boys, which is on the surface not fantastic, but when you think about, the distances being twice as long, the heat, everything, it was amazing to me that he did it. He was the only boy in Cambridge who competed, who even tried to do it. So I think that shows that Gideon has this tenaciousness in his personality. And I guess basically what I'm trying to say is, Gideon, don't lose that tenaciousness, and just try to be excellent at whatever you love, and you will be successful.